Picture this. It's December 26th, 1776, and you're a Hessian soldier standing guard duty in Trenton, New Jersey. Your head is pounding from last night's Christmas celebration. The sleet is hammering down so hard you can barely see 20 feet in front of you. You're cold, you're miserable, and you're absolutely certain that no army in its right mind would be moving in this weather. Then, through the howling wind and ice, you hear something that makes your blood freeze colder than the storm. Drums, American drums. You spin around, squinting through the sleet, and what you see is impossible. Thousands of ragged Continental soldiers are pouring into the streets of Trenton like a flood. They're not supposed to be here. They can't be here. The Delaware River is choked with ice. No one could cross it in this storm. But they did cross it. And in the next 45 minutes, your entire garrison of 1,500 professional German soldiers is going to be destroyed by an army that everyone in Europe believes is already dead. This isn't just another raid. This is the moment George Washington transforms from a general who loses battles into the man the British Empire learns to fear. This is the morning when the American Revolution, which was gasping its last breath just 24 hours ago, suddenly roars back to life. And it all depends on a gamble so desperate, so seemingly suicidal, that Washington's own officers think he's lost his mind. Welcome to the Battle of Trenton, the 45 minutes that saved the American Revolution and created the legend of George Washington. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Washington didn't win at Trenton because he was brilliant. He won because he was desperate. His army was disintegrating. His men were deserting by the hundreds. The Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia in terror. The British were preparing victory parades. By every measure that matters in war, Washington had already lost. So, why are we still speaking English with an American accent instead of British? Why did the British Empire, which had crushed Scotland, dominated India, and ruled the seas, fail to put down a rebellion of farmers and shopkeepers? The answer lies in 9 hours of hell on Christmas night, 1776. 9 hours when Washington bet everything on a single roll of the dice. 9 hours that taught the British Army that this ragged collection of rebels could do the impossible. To understand why Trenton mattered, you have to understand just how close the American cause was to total extinction in December of 1776. We're talking about a nation that was literally dying. 6 months earlier, everything had looked so promising. The Declaration of Independence had been signed on July 4th. Washington commanded an army of 20,000 men. The British had been forced to evacuate Boston after Washington fortified Dorchester Heights with cannons that Henry Knox had dragged 300 miles from Fort Ticonderoga. Across the colonies, people believed that independence was inevitable, that God himself was on their side. Recruiting stations were flooded with volunteers. Men lined up to sign their names and fight for freedom. Then reality arrived in the form of 32,000 British and German soldiers landing on Long Island. The British commander, General William Howe, was no fool. He was a professional soldier who'd fought in some of the hardest campaigns in Europe. He'd served with distinction in the 7 Years' War. He'd learned his craft from some of the finest military minds in the world. He looked at Washington's army of enthusiastic amateurs and decided to teach them a lesson about real warfare. That lesson began on August 27, 1776, at the Battle of Long Island. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Washington had divided his forces, spreading them too thin across Brooklyn Heights. He'd left gaps in his lines big enough for entire regiments to march through. He'd posted inexperienced militia at critical positions. He'd made every mistake a commander could make. The British, moving with the precision of a machine, flanked him on his left, surrounded him, and trapped his entire army against the East River with their backs to the water. Washington should have surrendered right there. He had 9,000 men pinned against a river with the entire British army in front of them. There was no escape, no reinforcements, no hope. Any reasonable commander would have raised the white flag and tried to negotiate terms. Instead, Washington pulled off one of history's greatest escapes. On the night of August 29th, using every boat he could find, he ferried his entire army across the East River to Manhattan. The evacuation took all night. Men rowed back and forth in the darkness, praying the British wouldn't hear them. And then, just as dawn was breaking and the British were about to discover what was happening, a thick fog rolled in from nowhere, covering the final boats as they pushed off from shore. It was a miracle. The troops called it divine intervention. But miracles don't win wars. For the next 3 months, Washington did nothing but retreat. He retreated from Manhattan to Harlem Heights. When the British flanked him there, he retreated to White Plains. When they came at him again, he retreated across the Hudson River into New Jersey. He retreated through Newark, through New Brunswick, through Princeton. He retreated so fast and so far that his own men started calling him the Old Fox because he was always running away. Every time the British attacked, Washington ran. Every time they tried to trap him, he slipped away in the night, leaving campfires burning to fool them into thinking he was still there. The newspapers back in the colonies started calling him His Excellency General Retreat. British officers made jokes about him in their mess halls, betting on how far he'd run before finally surrendering. The British thought this was cowardice. They were wrong. It was survival. Washington understood something that took the British years to figure out. As long as his army existed, the revolution existed. The Continental Army wasn't just a military force. It was the physical embodiment of American independence. If he stood and fought and lost, the war was over. The British would hang him, and every officer who'd signed the Declaration. They'd execute the ringleaders and send the colonies crawling back to the king. So, Washington traded space for time, bleeding his army mile by mile across New Jersey, hoping something would save him. A French alliance, a British mistake, a miracle from heaven, anything. But by December, there was nothing left to trade. He'd run out of space. He'd run out of time. He'd run out of everything except desperation. Washington's army had shrunk from 20,000 men to fewer than 3,000 combat-ready soldiers. Disease had ravaged the ranks. Dysentery, typhus, and smallpox killed more men than British bullets. Desertion had thinned them further. Every morning, officers woke to find fewer men in camp than the night before. Soldiers simply walked away, heading home to farms and families, convinced the cause was lost. The men who remained were walking skeletons wrapped in rags. Most of them didn't have shoes. They'd worn them out in the long retreat. They wrapped their feet in scraps of cloth and kept marching, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Their uniforms, if you could call them that, were falling apart. Some men wore captured British coats. Others wore homespun hunting shirts. Many wore nothing but threadbare civilian clothes that offered no protection against the brutal winter. They were armed with a motley collection of weapons. Some had decent brown bess muskets captured from the British. Others carried Pennsylvania rifles, long-barreled hunting weapons that were accurate but slow to reload. A few had nothing but farming tools, axes, and knives they had brought from home. They looked less like an army and more like a mob of refugees. Their enlistments were expiring in 5 days, on December 31st. The Continental Army had been formed with short-term enlistments because no one thought the war would last this long. Most of the men had signed up for 1 year. That year was ending. When the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve, thousands of soldiers would be free to go home, and almost all of them planned to do exactly that. Washington tried everything to convince them to stay. He offered bonuses. He made speeches. He appealed to their patriotism. Nothing worked. These men had given a year of their lives. They'd fought, bled, and watched their friends die. They'd marched hundreds of miles. They'd starved and frozen. They'd done everything asked of them. Now they wanted to go home. The Continental Congress, which was supposed to be running the war, had fled Philadelphia on December 12th when British forces got close. They'd scattered to Baltimore in a panic, leaving behind a city that was preparing to welcome the British as liberators. Congress had given Washington dictatorial powers, complete authority to do whatever he needed to win the war. But they'd given him these powers because they literally didn't know what else to do. They expected him to surrender. They were just trying to avoid being the ones who officially gave up. The British were so confident of victory that they'd stopped chasing Washington and had settled into winter quarters. In the 18th century, armies didn't campaign in winter. Roads became impassable. Rivers froze. Supplies couldn't move. Men died from exposure faster than they died from combat. Everyone knew you fought from spring to fall, then went into winter quarters to rest, refit, and wait for good weather. General Howe went back to New York City to enjoy the season with his mistress, a beautiful loyalist woman named Elizabeth Loring. He left a string of garrisons across New Jersey to hold the territory they had conquered. These outposts stretched in a line from New Brunswick to Trenton, to Bordentown, to Burlington. Each garrison was strong enough to defend itself, but close enough to support the others if attacked. The largest of these garrisons was at Trenton, manned by 1,500 Hessian soldiers under the command of Colonel Johann Gottlieb Rahl. The Hessians were German mercenaries, rented out by their princes to the British crown. This was common practice in the 18th century. Small German states had professional armies but no wars to fight, so they leased their soldiers to other countries for profit. It was a business transaction. The British paid good money. The German princes pocketed the cash. The soldiers did the fighting and dying. But these weren't reluctant conscripts. They were professionals. Many of them came from the state of Hesse-Kassel, which had been producing soldiers for hire for generations. They wore crisp uniforms of blue with red or yellow facings. They marched in perfect formations. They'd fought in some of the most brutal wars in Europe, including the 7 Years' War, where they'd faced the Austrians, the French, and Frederick the Great's Prussians. They knew their craft. A Hessian regiment could load and fire 4 volleys per minute. They could march 30 miles in a day. They could build a fortified camp in an afternoon. Most importantly, they were disciplined. They didn't break and run when things got tough. They stood in line and fought until ordered to withdraw. To them, the American rebels were a joke. Undisciplined rabble with rusty muskets and no idea how to fight a real battle. They'd seen the Continental Army retreat for 3 months. They'd watched American militias scatter at the first British volley. They'd captured fort after fort, city after city, with barely any resistance. Colonel Rahl, in particular, had nothing but contempt for the Americans. He was a 49-year-old career soldier who'd spent his entire adult life in uniform. He'd fought bravely at White Plains and Fort Washington, leading bayonet charges that had scattered American defenders like leaves in the wind. When his officers suggested building fortifications around Trenton, constructing earthworks and redoubts to protect the garrison, he laughed at them. "Let them come," he reportedly said. "We will go at them with the bayonet." He believed that German steel would scatter American courage like mist before the sun. He'd seen it happen before. Why would this time be any different? The rebels didn't have the stomach for cold steel. They'd run as soon as his men leveled their weapons and advanced. This arrogance was about to cost him everything. Trenton itself was a small town of about 100 houses clustered around 2 main streets, King Street and Queen Street, which ran parallel from north to south. The Delaware River formed the western boundary. A sun-pink creek, a small waterway, ran along the southern edge. The town sat on relatively flat ground, surrounded by farms and orchards. It was a good position for a garrison. The roads leading into town could be easily watched. The river protected one flank, the creek protected another. But Rahl hadn't bothered to fortify any of it. No earthworks, no redoubts, no trenches. His men were housed in private homes and public buildings throughout the town. The only defensive preparations were the sentries posted on the roads leading in. Rahl's garrison consisted of 3 Hessian regiments: the Rahl Regiment, which bore his name, the Lossberg Regiment, and the Kniphausen Regiment. Together, they numbered about 1,400 infantry, plus a company of 50 Hessian Jaegers, elite light infantry armed with rifles, and a detachment of 20 British dragoons for scouting. The Hessians had been at Trenton for about 3 weeks. They'd settled into a routine: guard duty, patrols, drill, the monotony of garrison life. The townspeople, mostly loyalists or people trying to stay neutral, coexisted with them uneasily. Some supplied the garrison with food and supplies. Others simply tried to stay out of the way. On Christmas Day, Rahl gave his men permission to celebrate in the German tradition. This meant food, drink, and music. Lots of drink. The officers gathered at Abraham Hunt's house, a prominent loyalist's home in the center of town. They ate a feast. They played cards. They drank wine and brandy until late into the night. A local loyalist farmer named John Honeyman, actually a spy working for Washington, but no one knew that yet, had tried to deliver a message to Rahl during the party. The message warned that the Americans might attack. Rahl was annoyed at being interrupted during his celebration. He took the note, folded it without reading it, and stuffed it into his pocket. He'd deal with rebel rumors later. Tonight was for celebrating. The party lasted until after 2 in the morning. Officers stumbled back to their quarters drunk and exhausted. The enlisted men, given similar liberty, had done the same throughout the town. By 3 in the morning, Trenton was quiet. The sentries on duty were cold, miserable, and mostly focused on staying warm rather than watching for an enemy that everyone knew wouldn't be stupid enough to attack in this weather. Across the Delaware River, 9 miles away, Washington sat in his headquarters and stared at a map. The room was cold. A fire burned in the fireplace, but couldn't seem to warm the space. Outside, sleet hammered against the windows. It was the kind of night where you didn't want to be outdoors for 5 minutes, let alone all night. Washington was 54 years old. He looked older. The last 6 months had aged him. His face was drawn, his eyes were tired. He'd barely slept since the retreat from New York began. Every day brought new problems. Supplies that didn't arrive, reinforcements that never showed up, officers who wanted to resign, men who wanted to desert. He'd crossed the Delaware River on December 11th, taking every boat for 70 miles with him so the British couldn't follow. It was a smart move. The river was his shield, but it was also his prison. He was trapped on the wrong side of the water, with an army that was going to evaporate in 5 days. He needed a victory, not a small raid, not a skirmish that could be spun as a success in the newspapers. A real, undeniable, significant victory that would prove to his men, to Congress, to the French, and to himself that this cause wasn't dead, that the American Revolution was still alive and fighting. His officers thought he'd lost his mind when he announced his plan on December 23rd. He wanted to cross the Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles through a winter storm, and attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton at dawn. The room went silent when he finished explaining. Then the objections started. The river was choked with ice. Half the men didn't have shoes. A winter storm was coming that would make movement almost impossible. The Hessians were professional soldiers who outnumbered them. If the attack failed, the army would be destroyed and the revolution would end. Colonel Henry Knox, Washington's artillery chief, looked at the plan and saw only disaster. Knox was a former Boston bookseller who taught himself military engineering by reading books. He was also Washington's friend, one of the few people who could speak candidly to the commander. Knox was a huge man, 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighing over 300 pounds. His voice boomed when he talked. Right now, he was using that voice to argue against the attack. "Your Excellency," Knox said carefully, "the risks are enormous. If we lose even one gun to the river, if the powder gets wet, if the men freeze before we reach Trenton, we'll have nothing left. The army will cease to exist." Washington listened to all the objections. He heard every argument about why the plan wouldn't work. Then he made a decision that would define his entire career. He was going anyway. "Necessity, dire necessity, will, nay, must justify my attack," he said. Those words reveal everything about Washington's thinking. He wasn't gambling out of recklessness or ambition. He was gambling because there were no other options left. The army was dying. The cause was dying. Doing nothing meant certain defeat. Attacking meant probable defeat, but probable defeat was better than certain defeat. At least there was a chance. Washington gathered his senior officers and laid out the detailed plan. The army would split into 3 separate forces for the crossing. Washington himself would lead the main body of 2,400 men across the river at McConkey's Ferry, about 9 miles north of Trenton. This force would carry all the artillery and most of the infantry. A second force of about 700 men under Colonel John Cadwalader would cross near Bristol and attack the Hessian outpost at Bordentown to prevent reinforcements from reaching Trenton. A third force of about 600 men under General James Ewing would cross directly opposite Trenton and seize the bridge over Assunpink Creek, cutting off the Hessian retreat. All 3 crossings would happen simultaneously on Christmas night. All 3 forces would coordinate their attacks to hit at dawn. The Hessians would be trapped in Trenton, with Americans attacking from multiple directions and no way to escape. It was an elegant plan on paper. In reality, it required perfect coordination, perfect timing, and perfect luck. 3 separate forces crossing a frozen river at night, marching through a storm, and attacking simultaneously at dawn. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. Washington set the departure time for sunset on Christmas Day, December 25th. The men were to cook 3 days of rations and prepare for a march. No one told them where they were going. Secrecy was absolute. If word of the attack leaked to the Hessians, if Loyalist spies got even a hint of the plan, the entire operation would fail. The password for the night was victory or death. Soldiers were ordered to wear a piece of white paper in their hats so they could identify each other in the darkness. Officers were told to carry lanterns but keep them covered until absolutely necessary. No smoking, no talking, complete silence. It wasn't propaganda. It was a statement of fact. If this attack failed, the American Revolution was over. There would be no second chance, no fallback position, no army left to fight with, victory or death. As Christmas Day dawned, Washington made his final preparations. He drafted orders to his subordinate commanders. He checked and rechecked the assembly points. He personally inspected the boats that would carry them across. He was leaving nothing to chance because he couldn't afford even one mistake. The men spent Christmas Day in their camps, trying to stay warm. They cooked their rations, strips of salt pork and hard flour cakes. They checked their weapons, making sure the flints in their muskets were secure, that their powder horns were full. They wrote letters home, not knowing if they'd survive to write another. Some of them prayed. Many of them were just boys, Teenagers who'd left their farms to fight for independence and who now found themselves preparing to attack professional German soldiers in the middle of a winter storm. They had to be terrified. But they didn't leave. They didn't desert. Something kept them there. Loyalty to Washington, belief in the cause, or maybe just the fact that they'd come this far and couldn't quit now. As darkness fell on Christmas night, the men assembled at McConkey's Ferry. The riverbank was chaos, 2,400 soldiers trying to organize in the darkness and the growing storm. Officers shouted orders, sergeants counted heads, men stamped their feet against the cold. The Delaware River stretched before them like a black serpent. Chunks of ice floated past, gleaming in the faint light. The wind howled. The temperature was dropping fast, already below freezing and falling. This was going to be a nightmare. The crossing was supposed to begin at sunset, around 6 o'clock. It didn't. The storm that Washington had counted on to hide his movements turned into a monster. Sleet hammered down in sheets, driven by a wind that cut through clothes like they were made of paper. The visibility dropped to almost nothing. Men could barely see the person standing next to them. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment, fishermen from Massachusetts who'd been recruited specifically because they knew boats, manned the crossing. These were hard men who'd spent their lives on the North Atlantic. They'd caught cod in the winter waters off Newfoundland. They'd weathered nor'easters and winter gales that would have killed lesser sailors. But even they looked at the Delaware that night and shook their heads. The boats they were using were Durham boats, cargo vessels designed to carry iron ore down the river. They were 40 to 60 feet long, 8 feet wide, and flat-bottomed. In calm water, a crew of 4 could pole one of these boats carrying 15 tons of cargo. Tonight, they'd be loaded with soldiers, artillery, horses, and supplies, trying to cross a river filled with ice in the middle of a blizzard. Washington stood on the bank and watched the first boats push off into the darkness. He was a tall man, 6 feet 3 inches, which made him a giant in the 18th century. He sat his horse easily, watching everything, missing nothing. He didn't give speeches. He didn't try to inspire the men with words. His presence was enough. The boats pushed off into the current and immediately began to spin. The Marblehead men fought the current with their oars, cursing under their breath. The ice chunks slammed into the wooden hulls with sounds like gunshots. One boat took a hit that punched a hole in its side. The crew frantically bailed water while trying to make it to the far shore. They barely made it. Other boats were swept downstream by the current. The plan called for them to land at a specific point on the New Jersey shore. Instead, they landed hundreds of yards away and had to march back to the assembly point in the darkness. Every minute of delay made success less likely. The crossing was supposed to take 3 hours. It took 9 hours of hell. Men sat in the open boats, exposed to the sleet and wind, growing colder and colder. Some of them fell asleep from exhaustion and had to be shaken awake when they reached the far shore. Others sat with their eyes closed, praying. The artillery was the worst. Henry Knox had 18 cannons to get across the river. Each cannon weighed hundreds of pounds. They had to be loaded onto boats carefully, or they'd capsize. The horses that would pull the guns had to be ferried separately. The ammunition wagons had to come across. It was a logistical nightmare that somehow, miraculously worked. By midnight, only half the force had crossed. Washington stood on the New Jersey shore now, watching more boats arrive. His careful schedule was destroyed. He'd planned to attack at 5 in the morning, 1 hour before dawn. Now there was no way they'd reach Trenton before 8, maybe later. The sun would be up. The advantage of surprise would be compromised. Everything was going wrong. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the last boat touched the New Jersey shore. Washington's entire force was finally across. But they were 3 hours behind schedule. They were exhausted. They were freezing. Their muskets were soaked. Half the powder was probably ruined. And they still had 9 miles to march. General Nathaniel Greene, one of Washington's most trusted commanders, rode up to him. Greene was 34 years old, a former Quaker from Rhode Island, who'd been kicked out of his church for joining the army. He was smart, aggressive, and loyal. Right now, he looked worried. "Your Excellency," Greene said quietly, "we're badly behind schedule. The men are exhausted. Many of them are suffering from exposure. Their muskets may not fire. We could call off the attack and try again another night." Washington looked at Greene. Then he looked at his army, 2,400 men standing in the sleet on the New Jersey shore, shivering and miserable, but still ready to follow him. He thought about the 5 days left before their enlistments expired. He thought about the British sitting warm and comfortable in their winter quarters, convinced the war was over. He gave the order to march. The 9-mile march from the Delaware River to Trenton should have taken 3 hours. It took 5 hours of pure hell that soldiers who survived would remember for the rest of their lives. The road, if you could call it that, was a muddy track covered in ice. Every step was treacherous. Men slipped and fell constantly. Those without shoes wrapped their feet in rags, but the rags quickly soaked through and froze. They left trails of blood in the snow. The sleet came down harder, stinging exposed skin like needles. The wind howled through the trees. Washington had split his force into 2 divisions to make the march faster and to approach Trenton from multiple directions. General John Sullivan took about 1,200 men down the river road, which ran along the Delaware. General Nathaniel Greene took the other 1,200 down the Pennington Road, a longer route that would bring them into Trenton from the north. The plan was elegant. Sullivan would hit Trenton from the west. Greene would hit from the north. The 2 forces would link up in the town center, trapping the Hessians between them. But to work, both columns had to arrive at exactly the same time. In the darkness, in the storm, marching on different roads, staying coordinated was almost impossible. The men marched in silence. There was no talking, no singing, no laughter. Just the sound of boots crunching in the snow and the rattle of equipment. The sleet hammered down so hard it sounded like static. Many of the soldiers were teenagers, farm boys who'd never been more than 20 miles from home before this. They'd signed up thinking war would be glorious. Instead, they'd spent 6 months retreating, starving, and watching friends die. Officers moved up and down the column constantly, checking on their men. They had to make sure soldiers weren't falling out, weren't sitting down in the snow to rest. Sitting down meant death. The cold would kill you in minutes if you stopped moving. Private John Greenwood from Massachusetts later wrote about the march. "I was so cold that I wanted to sit down and give up. My feet were frozen. My hands were frozen. I couldn't feel anything. But we kept walking, 1 foot in front of the other. If you stopped, you died. So we kept walking." Washington rode up and down the line on his horse, a massive white animal that was hard to miss even in the darkness. He checked on his men. He spoke quietly to officers. He didn't give inspiring speeches. What could he say that would make this better? Instead, he just showed them that he was there, suffering with them, refusing to quit. Around 6 in the morning, as the first gray light of dawn began to appear, a messenger from Sullivan's column found Washington. The river road was flooded in places. Sullivan's men had waded through freezing water up to their waists. Much of their powder was wet. The muskets might not fire. Should they turn back? Washington's response was immediate. "Tell General Sullivan to use the bayonet. I am resolved to take Trenton. Use the bayonet. If the guns won't fire, use cold steel. There would be no turning back." By 7:30 in the morning, the advance scouts reported they were approaching Trenton. Through the trees, through the sleet, soldiers could see the first houses of the town. There were no alarm bells, no drums, no sign that the Hessians knew 1,500 armed men were closing in on them. Washington called a halt just outside the town. He needed to give his men a few minutes to catch their breath, to form up into proper attack formations. More importantly, he needed Sullivan's column to get into position. The whole plan depended on hitting the Hessians from 2 directions simultaneously. The minutes ticked by. 7:45, 7:50. Where was Sullivan? Had his column gotten lost? Had they been discovered? Washington couldn't wait much longer. Dawn was breaking. Surprise was slipping away. At 7:55, a messenger arrived. Sullivan's column was in position on the river road. They were ready to attack. Washington looked at his officers. Henry Knox with the artillery. Nathaniel Greene commanding the right wing. John Sullivan on the left. These men had crossed a frozen river with him, marched 9 miles through a blizzard, and were now ready to attack professional soldiers in broad daylight with wet powder and frozen hands. He gave them a nod. That was all. Just a nod. At 8 o'clock in the morning, a Hessian patrol on the Pennington Road spotted the Americans. For a moment, the German soldier just stared, unable to believe what he was seeing. Then he raised his musket and fired a warning shot. The sound echoed across the frozen fields. He turned and sprinted back toward town, shouting at the top of his lungs. "Der Feind! Der Feind! Heraus! Heraus! The enemy! The enemy! Turn out! Turn out!" The trap was sprung, and there was no going back now. Washington stood in his stirrups and pointed his sword toward Trenton. His voice carried across the frozen field. "Forward! Press on, boys!" 2,400 American soldiers, cold, exhausted, and hungry, charged toward the town like a flood breaking through a dam. The Battle of Trenton had begun. For Colonel Johann Rahl, Christmas night had been everything a professional soldier's celebration should be. The Hessian officers had gathered at Abraham Hunt's house, one of the finest homes in Trenton. The table was laden with roasted meats, fresh bread, and plenty of wine. The German officers relaxed, laughing and telling stories. They played cards, smoked pipes, and enjoyed being indoors and warm while the storm raged outside. Rahl was in his element. He was a gregarious man who loved good food, good drink, and good company. The war in America had been profitable for him. He'd earned a reputation for bravery at White Plains and Fort Washington. His men respected him. His superiors valued him. After the war ended, which would be soon, he'd returned to Germany as a decorated veteran with money in his pocket. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. A local farmer had urgent information for Colonel Rahl. The servant who answered tried to send the man away, but he was insistent. Finally, the servant took a note from the farmer and brought it into the dining room. Rahl was in the middle of a card game. He was winning. He was also quite drunk. When the servant handed him the folded note, Rahl barely glanced at it. He assumed it was some civilian complaining about soldiers stealing chickens or some other trivial matter. Without opening it, he stuffed the note into his waistcoat pocket and went back to his cards. That note contained a warning that Washington was planning to attack. The farmer who delivered it was a loyalist who'd heard rumors and wanted to alert the garrison. If Rahl had read it, he would have had 8 hours to prepare defenses, to post extra guards, to ready his men for battle. The Battle of Trenton might never have happened, but he didn't read it. He was too drunk, too comfortable, and too convinced that the Americans were no threat. The note stayed in his pocket, unread, as he continued playing cards until after 2 a.m. When Rahl finally stumbled back to his quarters and collapsed into bed, he was completely confident about his position. The Americans were beaten. They were hiding across the river like frightened rabbits. No army would be stupid enough to attack in this weather. He could sleep soundly knowing his men had everything under control. He was still asleep at 8 o'clock the next morning when the warning shot echoed through Trenton. The alarm drums began beating frantically. All across town, Hessian soldiers were jolted awake. Some were still drunk from the night's celebrations. Others were groggy and confused. They stumbled out of their quarters, grabbing weapons, trying to understand what was happening. The non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and corporals who actually ran the army, reacted faster. They'd been soldiers long enough to know that when drums beat the alarm, you didn't ask questions. You grabbed your musket and formed ranks. They ran through the streets, shouting at men to fall in, to form companies, to prepare for battle. Rahl was one of the last to emerge. His head was pounding. His mouth tasted like copper. He pulled on his uniform jacket, grabbed his sword, and ran into King Street. What he saw must have felt like a nightmare. American soldiers were everywhere. They were pouring into Trenton from the north, down King Street and Queen Street, the 2 main roads through town. They were spreading through the side streets, taking up positions in houses and behind fences. And at the head of King Street and Queen Street, American artillery was being wheeled into position. Rahl's training kicked in despite his hangover. He had to organize his regiments, form battle lines, and counterattack. His men were professionals. They knew their jobs. If he could get them into formation, they could still win this. He screamed orders. Form line, Rahl Regiment center, Lossberg to the right, Kniphausen to the left. Prepare to advance. The Hessian soldiers, despite the chaos, despite the surprise, began to do exactly that. This is what made them professionals. They'd been drilled for years on how to form line under fire. Even half drunk and confused, they could do it almost automatically. The 3 regiments began to coalesce into proper formations in the streets of Trenton. If they had had 5 more minutes, they might have organized a defense. They might have even launched a counterattack. But Washington wasn't giving them 5 minutes. He wasn't giving them 5 seconds. Henry Knox's artillery opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic. 18 cannons firing simultaneously, the noise rolling across Trenton like thunder. Knox had positioned his guns perfectly. He'd placed them at the head of King Street and Queen Street, where the roads entered town. Every Hessian trying to form ranks had to do it in the open, directly in front of those cannons. Knox had loaded the guns with grapeshot and canister. Grapeshot is a canvas bag filled with iron balls about the size of golf balls. When fired, the bag disintegrates and the balls spread out, turning the cannon into a massive shotgun. Canister is even worse. It's a metal can filled with hundreds of musket balls. At close range, it doesn't wound soldiers. It erases them. The first volley from the American cannons tore through the forming Hessian ranks like a saw through wood. Men were thrown backward. Bodies were torn apart. The survivors stood there for a moment in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Then Knox's crews reloaded and fired again. And again. And again. The Hessian formations began to dissolve. Officers screamed at their men to hold ranks, but you can't hold ranks when cannonballs are ripping through your lines. The soldiers looked around desperately for cover. There wasn't any. They were in the middle of the street. Rahl, mounted on his horse, tried to rally his men. He was a brave man, whatever his flaws. He rode directly into the killing zone, shouting encouragement, trying to inspire his soldiers to stand firm. Some of them responded. The Rahl regiment began to form a proper line, despite the carnage. Then the American infantry opened fire. Washington had deployed his men brilliantly. While Knox's artillery hammered the main streets, the infantry spread through Trenton like water, flowing into side streets, taking positions in houses, firing from windows and doorways. The Hessians found themselves under attack from every direction. They couldn't see their enemy through the smoke and sleet. They couldn't form proper defensive positions. They were being shot at from houses, from alleys, from behind fences. The psychological impact was devastating. Hessian soldiers were trained to fight in the open, in formal battles where both sides could see each other. This wasn't formal. This was chaos. This was slaughter. And it was happening so fast they couldn't react. Rahl, desperate, made a decision. If he couldn't defend the town, he'd capture the American artillery. If his men could take those guns, they could turn the battle around. He ordered a bayonet charge up King Street, directly at Henry Knox's position. It was a brave decision. It was also suicide. The Hessian soldiers fixed their 17-inch bayonets to their muskets and charged. These were men who'd fought across Europe. They'd faced Austrian artillery, French cavalry, Prussian infantry. They knew how to charge cannons. You moved fast, closed the distance before the gunners could reload, and then you killed them with cold steel. But Knox's crews weren't the slow, methodical artillery teams the Hessians were used to. These were Americans who'd spent months learning to work together. They could reload a cannon in under a minute. And they had 18 guns, not 2 or 3. The charging Hessians ran into a wall of metal. The front ranks disintegrated. The men behind them stumbled over bodies and were cut down in turn. A few soldiers actually reached the cannons, but American infantry swarmed them, bayonets flashing. Within minutes, King Street was carpeted with German bodies. The Lossberg Regiment tried to escape to the south, toward the bridge over Assunpink Creek. They ran straight into more American troops who'd circled around behind the town. The Hessians found themselves trapped, unable to advance, unable to retreat. Some tried to surrender on the spot. Others threw down their weapons and sprinted for the houses, hoping to hide. A few officers tried to organize one more counterattack, but their men wouldn't follow. The will to fight had been beaten out of them. In the center of this chaos, Colonel Rahl was still trying to rally his troops. He rode back and forth, shouting orders that no one could hear over the gunfire. Then a musket ball struck him in the side. He gasped, nearly fell from his horse, but managed to stay mounted. He tried to give one more order, but another bullet hit him. This time he did fall, crashing into the snow. His men rushed to him, dragged him off the street into a nearby house. He was bleeding heavily from 2 wounds. He knew he was dying. Around him, the sounds of battle were fading. The shooting was becoming sporadic. The screaming was quieting down. One of his officers ran into the house. "Sir, the Americans are calling for our surrender. What should we do?" Rahl looked at him, his face pale with blood loss and shock. What could he do? His men were scattered. His formations were broken. He was dying. And he could hear more Americans arriving every minute, fresh troops pouring into Trenton. "Let them surrender," he whispered. "It's finished." By 9 o'clock, less than an hour after the first shot, the Battle of Trenton was over. It hadn't been a battle in the traditional sense. It had been closer to an execution. The Hessians, caught completely by surprise, disorganized and leaderless, had never had a chance. Washington's men rounded up prisoners throughout the town. Hessian soldiers emerged from houses with their hands up, their weapons abandoned. Officers formally surrendered their swords. The German banners, the proud regimental flags that had flown over battlefields across Europe, were folded and handed over to grinning American soldiers who could barely believe what they had accomplished. The final count was staggering. 918 Hessian soldiers captured, 83 dead, including Colonel Rahl, who would die of his wounds that evening. 27 wounded. 30 escaped, mostly the British dragoons and some Jaegers who managed to flee on horseback. American casualties? 2 men had frozen to death during the night march. 4 men were wounded in the battle, none seriously. 0 killed in combat. It was the most lopsided victory of the entire Revolutionary War. An impossible, ridiculous, shouldn't have happened victory that changed everything. Washington stood in the center of Trenton, surrounded by captured Hessians and piles of seized equipment. His men were exhausted but jubilant. They had crossed a frozen river, marched 9 miles through hell, and destroyed a professional army. They'd proven to themselves that they could win. For the first time in months, George Washington allowed himself to feel something like hope. But he also knew this was just the beginning. The British would hear about Trenton within hours. They'd be coming, and when they came, they'd be angry. He ordered his men to gather all the captured weapons, ammunition, and supplies. They loaded everything onto wagons. Then he gave the order to march back to the river. They had to get the prisoners and the captured equipment across the Delaware before the British could react. The return crossing was almost as difficult as the first, but this time, his men were carrying victory. This time, they were crossing not as defeated fugitives, but as conquerors. The difference was profound. By late afternoon, the entire army was back on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, safe, victorious, alive. Washington immediately sent messages to Congress, to state governors, to militia commanders. The Hessian garrison at Trenton had been destroyed. The Continental Army had struck a major blow against the British. The Revolution was still alive. When the news reached Philadelphia, which the British hadn't occupied after all, people poured into the streets. They rang church bells. They celebrated like the war was over. They weren't wrong to celebrate. Washington had given them something they desperately needed, proof that Americans could win, proof that the cause wasn't lost, proof that one more year of fighting might actually lead to victory. Congress, which had been cowering in Baltimore, suddenly found its courage. They authorized bonuses for soldiers who would re-enlist. They gave Washington more authority. They started acting like a government that believed it might actually win. But the most important impact was on the army itself. The men who'd been planning to go home on December 31st changed their minds. When Washington asked them to stay for 6 more weeks, most of them agreed. New recruits began arriving at camp. Young men who'd been sitting on the fence, waiting to see which side would win, suddenly decided the Americans had a chance. The Continental Army, which had been weeks away from extinction, was reborn. And it was reborn because one man had refused to accept defeat. Because George Washington had looked at an impossible situation and decided to do the impossible thing. The British, meanwhile, were in shock. General Howe received the news in New York and reportedly couldn't believe it. The Hessians were professionals. How had a mob of American farmers destroyed them? He immediately canceled his winter plans and ordered General Charles Cornwallis to take a large force and crush Washington once and for all. Cornwallis, who'd been literally boarding a ship to return to England for the winter, was furious. He unpacked his bags, assembled 8,000 men, and marched south into New Jersey with murder on his mind. He would trap Washington, destroy his ragtag army, and end this embarrassing rebellion. On January 2nd, 1777, Cornwallis reached Trenton with his army. Washington was there, waiting for him, dug in on the south side of Assunpink Creek. The British attacked immediately, trying to force a crossing. Washington's men held them off. As night fell, Cornwallis gathered his officers. They could see Washington's campfires across the creek. The American army was trapped with its back to the river. In the morning, they'd finish them off. Cornwallis reportedly told his officers, "We've got the old fox trapped at last. We'll bag him in the morning." But Washington wasn't trapped. That night, while his campfires burned and a few men stayed behind to make noise, he marched his entire army around Cornwallis's flank. By dawn, the Americans were gone, heading toward Princeton, where another British garrison waited. Cornwallis woke up to find empty camps and cold fires. He'd been fooled. The old fox had slipped away again. Furious, he turned his army around and raced toward Princeton, but Washington was already there. At Princeton, on January 3rd, Washington's army caught the British garrison by surprise. In a short, sharp fight that saw Washington personally lead a charge on horseback, the Americans routed the British and captured the town. Then, before Cornwallis could arrive with his main army, Washington marched his men into the hills of northern New Jersey, where the British couldn't follow. In 10 days, Washington had crossed the Delaware twice, won 2 battles, captured over 1,000 prisoners, and made the British look foolish. The general who'd spent 6 months in retreat had suddenly become the most dangerous commander in North America. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. For the Americans, Trenton and Princeton proved they could win. For the British, it proved the war wouldn't end quickly or easily. The confident predictions of victory in 1776 were replaced by grim assessments of a long, grinding conflict. More importantly, the Trenton-Princeton campaign convinced France that the Americans were worth supporting. French King Louis XVI had been watching the war with interest, looking for any excuse to hurt Britain. Trenton gave him that excuse. Within months, France would begin secretly shipping weapons and supplies to the Americans. Eventually, they'd send troops and ships, and French support would be crucial to ultimate American victory. George Washington emerged from the campaign as a legend. Before Trenton, he'd been the general who lost battles. After Trenton, he was the man who'd saved the Revolution. His willingness to attack when every reasonable person said to retreat, his refusal to quit when quitting was the logical choice, became part of American mythology. But Washington himself never claimed to be a genius. He knew Trenton had succeeded partly through British arrogance, partly through Hessian complacency, and partly through sheer desperate luck. If the crossing had taken any longer, if the Hessians had been alert, if the weather had been different, everything could have gone wrong. What Washington did understand was that wars aren't always won by the best tactics or the biggest armies. Sometimes they're won by refusing to accept defeat. Sometimes survival is victory. And sometimes attacking when everyone tells you it's impossible is the only rational choice left. The battle that made the British fear George Washington wasn't won with brilliant maneuvering or superior firepower. It was won with desperation, determination, and the willingness to suffer. It was won by men who crossed a frozen river because their commander asked them to, by men who marched through a blizzard because the cause required it, by men who attacked professional soldiers with wet powder and frozen hands because giving up wasn't an option. That Christmas night crossing has become an American legend, painted on canvases and taught to children. But the reality was more impressive than any legend. The reality was 9 hours of suffering on a frozen river, 5 hours of marching through hell, 45 minutes of brutal, efficient violence, and the birth of a nation that refused to die. Victory or death. On December 26, 1776, Washington's army chose victory, and in choosing it, they gave America its future.